Keylinks. And the purpose of Keylinks, actually there's a lot of architecture that relies on accurate keylink settings, because some of the strategies that I have for making the work offload to the server and really minimize the amount that comes over the wire, I rely heavily on using keylinks. And basically what keylinks do is it identifies the columns in that query that are necessary to uniquely identify an individual record that you're working with. And so in this case, you can just set it to auto-define. So with that, IBObjects has a fairly extensive schema or metadata caching. It goes out, it queries the metadata, and it will try to figure out your keylinks for you if you rather. If you're just doing something quick and ad hoc, then that can be quite handy. But in your applications, it definitely increases performance when you're working with a query to go in and explicitly define what your keylinks are, because then that eliminates all the steps that IBO would have to go through to figure out what it is on your behalf. And in a way, that kind of gives you an idea of the philosophy of these components. The idea is, as lazy as you want to be, I'll try to accommodate it. But then if you really want to get right down and close, intimate, right in, and really take control of everything, then IBObjects is willing to step out of the way to whatever degree you want it out of the way. In fact, you can even go right down to, I've surfaced methods on the cursor component that would allow you to just simply call the API directly. So if you have something that you've developed that you really want to absolutely maximize your performance, don't call the next method, call the API next method, because that eliminates a lot of other stuff that ordinarily somebody may need if they really aren't sure what they're doing. And so the idea with IBObjects is you can jump into it, you can just use it from a very high level, I just want it to do certain things, and then IBObjects is really trying to figure out everything in the middle to, okay, this is what they want to do, and how can there's a lot of algorithms and things that I do to try to do it efficiently. And then as you learn and get accustomed with this tool set, and you're like, okay, now I know really what these controls, these components are doing, but really is all I want to do is this. How can I just get right into the heart of it and have it be fast? Then you can drop down in levels and start to eliminate things if you don't need them. So anyway, in the case of this employee table, obviously our employee number should be the keylink, so you just drop it in there. Turn off the auto-define. Key relation, let's say that we have an alias for this called emp. So we want to tell it what our key relation is. So if you give your query those two pieces of information, there's all kinds of magic that's now available to you. And hopefully I'll have time we can show you some of that. One thing that separates IBObjects considerably is once you have a properly configured keylinks set up, now whenever you're dealing with the bookmark property, which is generally a string, or I think it's now a var bytes, basically you're just working with some usually arbitrary information. But with IBObjects, it's not arbitrary. I'm actually using the values from the server inside of your bookmark. So for example, IBX, it simply just used the numerical position of the record in the buffer was the bookmark. So if you refreshed your data set and then went back to this former bookmark, you could actually now be referencing some other record if there was a new record that was inserted on the server by another user or by some other means. And so whenever you would close and reopen an IBX data set, any bookmarks you stored anywhere are now worthless. You can't rely on them, and so you'd have to so you would either throw away your bookmarks or never close and reopen your queries, which, I mean, what's the point of a bookmark? I mean, you know, do you I mean, you want to put in the bookmark, close it, put it on the shelf and go to bed for the night and get it the next day and open it and have that bookmark be reliable. But as far as I know, IBObjects is the only component set that actually has bookmarks that are reliable, meaningful, that persist reliably between the closing and the reopening of your data sets. Is that new information for anyone that's been using IBObjects? Took it for granted, maybe? Okay. There's some additional things that are fairly helpful. For example, I've built into the query the ability to set up various ordering profiles. So let's just throw, oops, we don't do that. This one. Hire date, job grade, salary. Okay. So what we can do here is we can set up a table of various sorting that I would conceivably want to happen with my query. And you just give it a name, whatever you please. And then the ascending condition goes first, then you have a delimiting semicolon, and then you have the descending. And basically it just takes just a little chunk of whatever you want plugged into the order by clause, depending on how you've configured things. And so here's a table called ordering items, and then over here is another table called ordering links. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a column out of your query and associate it to a particular item. And so now you've got this employee number column that's associated with this first employee number ordering group that basically tells how, and I'll show you why that's significant. Basically, when you go into your data, and if you're using an ID grid, you can see these little glyphs up here adjacent to the column name. Basically what's happened is the ordering item associated to the employee number, it's letting you know that there's both an ascending and a descending ordering associated to that column. So now you can just click on the grid header and it will give you the ability to resort your table. And so all of this is without any code in your application. It's just making these property settings, and then all of these features just start to appear as if by magic. Okay. Let's see. One of the other fairly significant features is I have the equivalent of the various states, the data set states, but IBObjects adds a completely new state. So you could be in browse mode, you could be in edit mode, you could be in insert mode. And IBObjects has search mode. And so what happens when you go into the search state is all of the visual controls actually go into this state where you can put search criteria directly into your controls. And so when you do that, for example, remember what all the employee numbers were. So we've got 2, 4, 5, 6. We'll just play with search mode a little bit. So if I put in employee number 2 and then post the search mode, then it essentially puts together your query for you. It parses everything in necessary to assemble that query and executes it and brings back any matching records. There's various syntax to do that. Usually there's a Smith. Like, for example, if I put that %, no records found, no Smiths. Let's see. Now I need to get my form back. Okay, well, we'll find out who's in there. We've got a Johnson in there. So if I just put in JO %, then it'll just run that query and let's see, if I turn on the trace monitor, I'll try to show you some of what goes on behind the scenes. I highly recommend getting acquainted with this tool because it gives you a sense of what IBObjects is actually sending to the server, and sometimes you can get a good idea of how well you're doing things. For example, if you want a record count, I think in this case, because everything's buffered, it'll just tell you what's in memory. But if I go back into search mode, now there's nothing buffered. If I hit a record count, it's now actually going to put together the necessary query, send it to the server, get the record count, and bring it back. So if I put in some other different criteria, if I put in between 10 and 100, do a count. Rows, it just puts the answer down here if you hadn't noticed. Rows counted 22. So it basically just puts together the query for you and brings back the answer. So the idea obviously is get information that's buffered when you can. See, if I open this, if I clear this and I do a record count, nothing went to the server. It just says, hey, this query, all the records are fetched, everything's buffered, 22. I already got them. And so that's kind of getting acquainted with IBObjects, we'll call it its personality. When is it actually getting information from the server, and when is it just getting information from the client? That becomes important. Like in Pavel's talk, he says, whatever connectivity components you're using, you really need to commit yourself to them and get acquainted with how they work so that you can be sure that it's doing what you want in the most efficient, correct manner possible. Okay. And all of the IBObjects controls except for the grid have the ability to work with search mode. So there's checkboxes, drop-down lists, the memos, all of the IBObjects controls respond to search mode. In fact, let's see, I actually even have it set up to where if you have a master detail relationship, you can configure it so that when the master goes into search mode, the detail data set will go into search mode with it. If you put search criteria in the detail data set, you will actually get return only master records that correlates with a detail where that condition exists. And those queries are typically not the most efficient because you're using a subselect in your where clause. But that's the level of depth that you can actually work with IBObjects. So if you have a list of invoices and invoice items, you could if you wanted to see every invoice that has a particular invoice item, you would put those into search mode, choose the item, post search mode, and it would come back with a list of those invoices only that have that particular invoice item on it, associated to it. So search mode is actually quite involved. I also have little buffers so that you can save the criteria, clear, you run a query. When you're done, go back into search mode, and then you can recall previous criteria. So that's a little bit getting into the candy factor, but my users for the applications that I've written, they would often be bouncing back and forth between two things, and they found it handy, requested it, and so, there it is. Basically, IBObjects is the tool set I used during the 12 years that I worked full-time writing applications, and my tendency was, well, rather than put code in my application, how can I enhance and create additional value, reusable value in the component set? So just about everything that I ever needed during my 12 years of development for the Secretary of State, it's all inside of IBObjects. And my application code was very minimal, which was quite handy. I would like to stress, everyone that's using components like this, I think everybody should actually create their own subclass of my components, and then the things that you find yourself doing, I've made a lot of what goes on in IBObjects protected, virtual, so that depending on the level of intimacy that you want, it's all available, and I highly encourage, especially like with CETA Software, I'm more acquainted with their internal applications, and every software shop, they have their own typical things, and those really belong in your own object hierarchy somewhere and not scattered throughout all of these multitudes of forms in your application. So wherever possible, use that's one of the beauties and the great benefits of Delphi being an object-oriented language, is that I believe everybody really should be, okay, how can I put this new thing that I need to do, not in my application, but in my component layer? And because that's essentially what I did with IBObjects. Okay, let's see. We did search mode. Perhaps another interesting thing to show. I don't have, let's see. Well, trying to think of what would be of most interest. I've only got, 10 minutes, is that right?
Yeah.
Maybe with that 10 minutes, do you guys want to maybe hit me with something like, what about this, or... No, I don't mean, abuse me and physically cause me to bleed. Although I did need some clubbings on a few occasions. Is there anything that you would like me to show that I haven't yet, possibly? 10 minutes will go pretty quick. Yes?
Well, okay, so it's a short question. You said that you have a lot of buffering stuff, and
okay.
Well, that would yield to the problem that if someone else is actualizing something in the data, you will probably have to reload or something like that. Is there like a messaging mechanism or events or something like that?
Yeah, there is. I could go ahead and show that. I have a sample application that demonstrates how that works. That would probably be a useful Essentially the question, I think everybody could probably hear him, but basically, if I'm using an application and here I'm in this client-server environment where, let's say, there's 200 other people and they're impacting the database as well, is there a messaging mechanism that can efficiently propagate updates so that as I'm using my interface that fresh information comes quickly? And I do have some built-in functionality, and it relies essentially on meaningful bookmarks, because I actually have a fairly involved architecture for that, and we'll go ahead and jump into that. Let's see. I haven't run this in a while, so let's hope it works quite well. This is in the samples folder. It's called Survey. I was actually hired by a company who had a contract with Borland to write a survey engine for their website. And so I was working on this contract, and then Borland, for whatever reason, shafted the person I was doing this for, and so at the very least I got a decent sample application out of the effort. But we got stiffed by Borland. Let me get some of this noise out of the way here. Okay, I've got to remember there's a couple things possibly. What this does is it allows you to set up a list of surveys and a list of questions, and then relate one question might belong in more than one survey, so it's kind of a many-to-many type of relationship in the data here. And we were building in the ability to translate. So essentially I've got a main form, and then I've got two child forms, one for the surveys and one for the questions. And I can't remember if this is one that I just run and everything works, or if I need to fiddle with something. Let's see if it, just run it and see if it goes. Okay. It should create the database on the fly as needed. Okay. It's running, so that at least we know it created the database. And so if I pop on either of those buttons, I get a form. So here I can put in the surveys, like we all love to talk about the weather. I can't remember what some of these settings were. A pulse questionnaire. So, and this demonstrates too that I have it set up to where you can have a main toolbar, and then as you move from form to form or from control to control, this button bar actually keeps track of your context, and so it will take action on whatever you have focus on. So when I jump back over here, see it says post insert. If I jump over here, it's not in insert mode. And there's no code required for that. It all happens. So here we've created, let's create another survey. Let's say sports. And we'll call it a questionnaire. Post it. Now I'll create a question. Just something silly so that how cold it is now, do you guys know in that question? But you'll forgive me, right? The point is not in how brilliant of a survey creator I am. Let's see. Who will win the World Series? Whatever. This will be it. Well, I could give a list, but I don't want to offend anyone by not putting your team in the list. Okay, so now we've got these two sample data. If I want to create this sports survey and I've got all my questions down here and I want to relate them together, I can just click on that, drag it, and drop it in. If I want to put the other question in its survey, just drag and drop. And see down here now, we've got a list of what all surveys is this question in. And so if that says weather here. If I come up here in the weather grid, I think we'll all safely agree that there's two different queries involved here. So if I actually change this to weather today, or just something. If I post, watch down here, and if I've done my work correctly, then it will automatically reflect that change for you. And again, this doesn't require any application code. This is features that you just turn on with various little configuration settings. And so you have various distinct levels of context. In this case, we aren't involved with other users using the system. This is just the need to synchronize changes from one data set to another, which is actually probably one of the more frustrating aspects, because when you're working with XBase, because you're all pointing to that same local record, those types of changes just occurred immediately. And so one of the biggest irritations of client-server is, well, gosh, why doesn't it know I just changed it? Why is it, why do I have to totally rerun my query before I get the new version of that record? Because the Borland database engine, it actually just had everything local, and those kinds of changes happened and they were taken for granted. And so I think I'm getting close to the end of my session. Essentially, if you want this to pick up changes from other users, what you have to do is you have what's called a TID sync cursor, and you have to set up your own queue table on the server. And basically, is all you do is you set up using an interface event alerter and triggers. You post the events into a queue table, and then that synchronization cursor just simply listens to what all records of interest have changed, and then it will constantly respond to event alerters, fetch the necessary key data, and then it turns around and plugs it into the underneath everything's messaging system that basically says, these bookmarks are whatever, changed, deleted, added. And so all of these data sets, basically you just tell them to listen for notifications. It receives the bookmark and checks its own internal list of bookmarks and then acts accordingly. And so it's extremely efficient, and it works. So with that, I think I should conclude. I'll be around for the evening, so if anyone has any further questions, feel free to pin me down. Thank you. And if you don't know, there's my website. I'll just leave that up there for a minute while you gather your things. No.